Hello students, this is Professor Watts. As promised, I'm going to provide a little tutorial video here to help you with a few of the problems in homework 4 and help you get ready for this upcoming midterm exam this week. Okay, starting off with our aggregate supply-demand framework, and just a couple pointers on how to interpret this. Remember, on the vertical we have the inflation rate. In other words, how much are prices in the economy going up every year? And that might be a negative number if it's deflation, but typically it's inflation. Remember, it only moves in one direction. And then we have real GDP growth on the horizontal. Okay, and then we've got aggregate demand. Okay, and here it's labeled as delta as M arrow plus V arrow, and I'll maybe get into that later on in Unit 5. But think of this as money growth. Remember, I said interpret this as total nominal spending growth. In other words, how much more money is being spent in the economy each year, and that's going to be in a percent growth form. And I'm going to go back to an example I used on the board in class, and let's just say that's 6%. Why does the aggregate demand curve slope down? Well, any point on this curve represents 6% spending growth. Okay. Now, if we're up here, it could be all inflation and little real growth, let's say 0 and 6. Okay. Or we're down here at, let's say, 3% real growth and solve for inflation. Well, we're spending 6% more dollars, 3% more real goods to buy with those 6% more dollars. Solve for inflation rate, 3%. And if you ever get hung up on that, remember the example I used in class I had in time period 1, let's call it T1, we did 100 subs, and they cost $1 each. That was $100 of total nominal spending in my one good economy. And then in time 2, I've got 3% real growth, so 100 subs becomes 103. Okay, that's 3% higher. Total spending is up by 6%. We're going to be spending $106. Okay, that's plus 6%. How much does each sub cost? Well, it's simply 106 divided by 103. And if you don't remember from class, let me just refresh your memory on this math. Hey, about 1.029, that's about 1.03. That's approximately also a 3% growth rate. So inflation's 3%, every sub costs 3% more, growth is 3%, we have a 3% more sandwiches, and total spending is up 6%, the sum of real growth plus inflation. Okay, so remember, that's how the aggregate demand curve works. Now, let's review, let me reset here. Finally, let's just quickly review why the short-run aggregate supply curve slopes up. Okay, remember, this is sticky wages effect. Because wages respond to changes in spending slower than other prices, if you have inflation, if you have an increase in inflation, you have higher inflation, say an increase in aggregate demand, total spending, which we can draw like this. Okay, let's say total spending growth now is growing at 10%. Consumer goods prices rise first. Wages, which is an input, price up later. We have a temporary increase in business profits. And how do businesses respond to increase in profits? They expand production, more land, labor, and capital are employed. And so what do we see? We're going to see an increase in output here. And let's say output growth goes up to 5%. Now we also are going to see an increase in inflation because consumer goods prices are rising now, and eventually even more inflation because wages will rise, but initially it's only going to be, well, what can it be? If we're spending 10% more and 5% of it's spent on extra goods, 5% or the other half has to be spent on higher prices. Okay, so remember the affiliation here. When we talk about short-run aggregate supply sloping up, that is the sticky wages effect. Okay, so there's just a brief review of how the model works now. Okay, now let's work a problem like what we have in homework 4 here. First off, we said use the dynamic quantity theory of money to find the solid growth rate for this economy. Actually, we just did that, but let me redo that. I said we had aggregate demand, total spending growth of 6% in this example, and I said we have 3% inflation. Remember that real growth rate plus the inflation rate equals the total nominal spending rate, or aggregate demand, so this has to be 3%. 3% real growth plus 3% inflation equals 6% total spending growth. Now, part B said we're going to have a fall in the growth of the money supply. Spending growth falls to 4% per year. Draw the immediate result for aggregate demand in the graph. All that we're going to do here is put in a lower aggregate demand curve. And we'll label this aggregate demand prime, and let's say it's 4% spending growth. Okay. Now, we're going to say this fall in money growth lasts for many years. Eventually, in the long run, workers, business owners, and consumers all adjust their inflation expectations enough so that the economy returns to the solo growth rate. Draw the new short-run aggregate supply curve in the figure above. I didn't explicitly cover this in class, but you should be able to figure it out. Initially, what are we going to have? We're going to go down our short-run aggregate supply curve, and it's an indeterminate result because we don't know the exact slope of this, but it's going to be something less than 3% inflation and something less than 3% real growth that adds up to 4%. You know, let's say 2 and 2 maybe, just to pick some numbers that work. Right, now the second part of that question, though, says eventually the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to adjust. Here the short-run aggregate supply curve is based on pi e, which is how we designate inflation expectations, and this would be inflation expectation of 3%, okay, intersecting real full growth at 3% inflation. Basically, all we're having here is a downward shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve, where our equilibrium eventually returns to where we return to our solo growth rate. Remember, the solo growth rate is based on full utilization of the real factors of production, and this economy never lost real factors of production. How do we know that? It didn't say so in the problem. Okay, it just said we had an aggregate demand shock. If we're back to 3% real growth, we've got 4% spending growth. What's the inflation rate? Well, it's the difference between the new spending growth level and we're back to the original solo growth level. Look, that has to be 1%, okay? And that's the answer to the final part of the question. After spending growth falls, what will the solo growth rate be? What will inflation be? Now, when you do this problem, of course, you're going to have to work with the numbers given in the original problem, but you've seen an example of how I do it here using some different numbers. It should be pretty straightforward to apply the numbers from the problem. Okay, so hopefully you're all set for that particular problem. The other thing I'll address today on this tutorial is some questions on the Econ or the Austrian Business Cycle. Now, instead of just answering the question for you, I'm going to just kind of show you with the model again some kind of the basic themes that we're working through in the question, and then hopefully you can kind of put the pieces together and work through the problem on your own so you can understand it. What I want to specifically show us is I'm going to set up the model where I have the PPF, production possibilities frontier. And remember, this is a trade-off between consumption and investment. Do more of one, we have to do less of the other. And we're going to stack that on top of the loanable funds market or the credit market. That's where we have the interest rate. I'll just label that I, quantity of loanable funds, QLF, the credit market. And remember, you can just think of this as banks, although it's more than banks in reality. It's largely banks, so you can think of it as banks if that's helpful. Okay, banks take in money from people who have savings accounts, and then they lend it out to businesses and consumers to do purchases. And then finally, we will put in the Hayekian triangle, which is the representation of the structure of production, where we had the many stages, different kinds of capital. And remember, there was early stage capital back here, remote in time from consumption, passage of time on the horizontal, and late stage capital this end. Okay, now, first thing we want to think about here is a savings-induced decrease in interest rates. Let's start in PPF, and we're initially here at this point, C1, I1. Notice this, the value of consumption over here is the final product of the capital structure. Okay, savings-induced. So if we're saving more, we are consuming less. So let's drop consumption here, and let's up our saving, which of course allows us to increase investment. Go to C2, I2, and how does that play out in the loanable funds market? Well, or the credit market, as I called it here. We have a demand for loanable funds, which is from businesses who want to borrow, buy capital. What we did was an increase in savings, so I'll do S1, which was an initial amount of savings. What happened to savings? If we're consuming less, we are saving more. So we're going to shift out the supply curve of savings. And I'll do this like this, S2, and notice that this drops the interest rate right here. Go from I1 to I2, and you know we're going to have an increase in the quantity of investment funds. The question is, how is that going to affect the structure of production? Well, two ways to think about it, remember. Okay, in this, right here, it's just obvious that consumption goes down, which means that there's less demand for consumption, which is the final slice of the triangle here. Are we going to be investing in late-stage capital right next to consumption if consumption demand is down? No. So we're going to be reducing late-stage capital, but we're doing more investment. More investment, it's not in late stage. What's left for it to do? It's going to go into early stage. So we're going to add early stage investment, and we're going to shift this triangle this. We're actually going to add more stages to the capital structure, and over time that makes our economy much more productive because we made our capital structure what the Austrian economists call more roundabout. It's more time intensive, which is actually what makes an economy more productive. We're packing more capital, more steps, more process into production of consumer goods. That actually is what makes us more productive in the long run. Okay, so there is a savings-based reduction in interest rate, increase in early stage capital. How does an increase in consumer demand affect investment across these stages? Let's go back to the graph. Okay, now we're looking at an increase in consumer demand, and we want to see how that affects investment. Well, now we're moving up here on the PPF, more consumption, less investment. So investment is moving down. And let's think about what that does in the credit markets. Okay, if we are consuming P2 like this, if we are consuming more here, what's happening to savings here? Consuming more means we're saving less at any interest rate. So savings shifts like this, S2. And of course, we'll see that the amount of investment up here in the PPF lines up now with the new equilibrium in the credit market. So we make the same move down here, I2. And of course, the interest rate rises. People are less willing to save. Maybe they're more present-oriented, less future-oriented. And we're going to see that the interest rate makes our structure of production more present-oriented and less future-oriented. Where is the investment going to occur now? It's actually a lower level of investment. We're actually going to tack some on to the late stages because the economy wants more consumption goods right now. Okay, how are we going to do that? We're going to do that by taking it off of the early stages. So less early stage investment, more late stage investment. By the way, remember what I showed you with the present value tables. As interest rates go up, present value of long-term investments goes down. So we're going to see a shift away from long-term investments and towards shorter-term investments. As interest rates go up, there's a bigger change in long-term investments than there is in short-term investments. We are going to make this kind of move where we reduce long-term early-stage investments and we increase short-term late-stage investments. Okay, so that's option 2 right here, or option B. Finally, how does a monetary policy-induced interest rate reduction affect investment across these stages? Okay, back to our initial model. And now what we're going to look at is an increase in savings. It's not real resources. And remember, for real resources to be saved, we have to consume less of them. We put money in the bank, but the money represents a claim to real resources. What we're going to have here is what we call S plus delta M, which is the central bank padding the money supply in the banking system with newly printed money or newly created money. Okay, we've got the Fed injecting newly created money, of course, pushing interest rates down, call this I2, increasing the quantity of investment funds being lent out by banks. However, at the same time, we never really increased our savings, that is, we never reduced consumption. In fact, we're on the original supply curve of savings S1, and on that supply curve at that lower interest rate I2, we are saving less. I'm going to label that S. What we have, of course, is a gap between actual savings, what I've labeled S, and I2, what the economy is trying to invest. That, of course, is a shortage. Now, unlike a commodities market where the shortage will reveal itself immediately and push the price back up to equilibrium, because what's actually being borrowed as money, I should say what's on the surface, what's being borrowed as money, this can go on for some time, And the economy will try to do this. Investment tries to rise to this level, but consumption, because remember we're saving less, consumption also tries to rise to this level. We're trying to consume more and invest more at the same time. We're trying to achieve this point here on a imaginary PPF that's not really available to us. Okay? And remember, through the working overtime effects that I talked about in class, we can temporarily achieve this, but it involves trying to extend the capital structure in both directions at the same time. Okay, we're trying to do this extra investment at the lower interest rate, which wants to add early stage. Okay, that's the low interest rate effect. But we're also trying to consume more, which is the, I'll call it the non-savings effect. We're trying to change a capital structure like this and like this at the same time. And the Austrians' point is that that's not sustainable. You can temporarily rise above the PPF. Once you realize it's normally through higher inflation because we're adding money to the economy. This is inflationary. And what happens is when prices rise, interest rates must rise too eventually through what's called the Fisher effect. Eventually the interest rate will reverse itself, come back up to an equilibrium. Meanwhile, we tried to add early stage capital, which present value now goes low or negative because of the interest rate going back up, and those projects are wasted. Okay, that's a waste of resources. That is a malinvestment. Also, if interest rates go back up, we're induced to save more, so consumption comes down. So some of this investment here might be lost as well. So what happens is this extra investment that was tacked on here and here in the economy cannot be completed, or not all of it at least. Much of it is wasted, and the structure of production is going to be shrunk down to this level, and we are going to come crashing down to a lower PPF, okay, something like this, back at the somewhere close to the original equilibrium, maybe about right there, somewhere close to the original equilibrium of savings and investment demand. Okay, so there's just a brief review of how the Austrian business cycle works. Hopefully that's a little help for you on working through the homework problem. Like I said in class, you can expect to see any of the kind of homework problems from homework 3 and 4 on the exam. Also, just make a quick note here for the exam. You want to review chapters 11, 12, and 13, and lecture notes 8, 9, 10, and the one on Austrian business cycle theory.